Can the Warriors beat the Rockets in the first round, and do they have enough to get all the way to the finals this season, despite the fact that Steph Curry and Jimmy Butler have played less than half a season together? I think so. I think they have just enough to be a true contender this season and make it all the way to the finals. The problem is that Steve Kerr has yet to figure out the most sensible lineups and combinations that he can throw out there so that this team may thrive. As a matter of fact, Kerr has mostly put out a bunch of lineups where the Warriors have to survive these lineups rather than thriving with them. And if you've been following this channel, obviously you know what some of those problems are. So in this video, I'm going to go over the best combinations that Warriors can use in terms of the starting lineup, the Steph Curry centric lineup, the Jimmy Butler centric lineup, and their closing lineups, which may include some bigger lineups. It may also include the lineups that Steve Kerr absolutely loves to go to at all costs, is the smaller lineups, and which players should be in those smaller lineups so that the Warriors may thrive to close a game rather than trying to survive the closing minutes and have trouble doing it because Kerr is throwing out lineups that are not good enough from a fundamental standpoint to cover the basics to be good enough to close a game with lineups like that against the best teams in the league, teams in the playoffs, the Rockets, and whoever else that may be waiting for them in the future. So if you like what you've heard so far, be sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and hit that like button so that this gets out to all the Warriors fans out there. Okay, let's get straight to it. The starting lineup. We have been talking about the starting lineup on this channel for a very long time. The starting lineup that Steve Kerr is currently using, that is that small lineup of Steph Curry, Potts, Moody, Jimmy Butler, and Draymond, was cute in the regular season. You look at the stats, you look at the net rating, and you see, oh wow, they're such a positive. Oh, they're like a plus 16.7. Oh, that's super viable. And yet, whenever they try to close with said lineup, or when they face real competition with real size, whether that's the Nuggets, whether that's the Lakers, whether that's the Clippers, and sometimes even against non-viable teams like the Spurs, and especially when the Warriors get into clutch situations in the fourth quarter, that starting lineup is not good enough because the Warriors are utilizing essentially a 3-guard lineup. I know that Moses Moody is capable of playing the small forward position in a pinch for the Warriors, but in order for the Warriors to completely thrive, you don't want Moody in there with the tandem of Draymond Green and Jimmy Butler at the center and the power forward spot. Because when the Warriors elect to go with these smaller lineups, they need more overall size. Moody is a 6'5" POA. The guy has a 7-foot wingspan, so he's pretty good out there against certain matchups. So if you want to stick this guy at the 2, now the Warriors have a little more size from an overall standpoint. And then you stick another guy at that small forward spot that is bigger than Moses Moody, can rebound better, has more switchability, has more versatility from an overall size standpoint. They need this in order for the Warriors to be able to play a thriving style of basketball when they go to these smaller lineups. When the prerequisites are not met of running those smaller lineups, then the Warriors are suddenly not good enough from the most basic fundamental standpoint. They're not even big enough to just cover the basics of boxing out and rebounding over the league that is going to be bigger than them because they're going small. So in recent iterations, Steve has run certain lineups such as Steph Curry, Potts, Buddy Hield. Absolutely ridiculous. You're closing with a 3-guard lineup with limited defenders. And then you're asking Draymond and Jimmy Butler to be magical and somehow protect that. No 2 small guys are going to be able to protect a 3-guard lineup of Steph Curry, Potts, and Buddy Hield. And Steve has tried some other iterations as well, such as Steph Curry, GPII, and Moody. And those lineups are also marginal at best and way too small from an overall standpoint. And then, of course, we have the Steph Curry, Potts, and Moody. That's that starting lineup. Yeah, so from a small forward standpoint, we've seen GP2 in those lineups, we've seen Buddy Hield in those lineups, and we've seen Moses Moody in those lineups. And the Warriors simply have not been anything close to over the top or like an utterly winning lineup when those guys are masquerading as a small forward in the small lineups next to Jimmy Butler and Draymond. and you look at the net rating of those 3-man units, you're going to see that the numbers are going to support the fact that the Warriors are not good enough when they run those lineups. Yeah, so let's check this out real quick. The first one at the small forward spot will be GP2, and the Warriors have a net rating of 7.3 when they run that lineup of GP2, Jimmy Butler, and Draymond Green. The next one up is Buddy Hield. Buddy Hield, Jimmy Butler, and Draymond Green. That has a net rating of 7.6. Next one up is Moses Moody, and they're a little bit better when they run that lineup. It's Moses Moody, Jimmy Butler, and Draymond, which has a net rating of 9.5. Now, some people may be wondering, what about Jonathan Kuminga? He's the biggest guy of that group. Why don't they try to close games with a bigger combination of Kuminga, Butler, and Draymond? Well, those three guys have a net rating of minus 24.9. End of story. I'm not even going to expand on this. Jonathan Kuminga's role is going to be and must be minimized going into the playoffs. I don't know, there may be spot situations at best where they might try to play him here and there. But to me personally, Jonathan Kuminga is not ready to compete at the highest level in the playoffs and play consistently. And it's certainly not going to work if they're going to go smaller with him as small forward. The numbers speak for themselves. Maybe there are other lineups where he's protected by Kevon Looney from a defensive standpoint, and see how those lineups work out. It has the potential to work out some, but honestly, in the playoffs, the players need consistency when it comes to the minutes that they're going to play. So you just can't be yo-yoing back and forth between this guy and that guy and hope that these guys are going to play consistent basketball. And Gui Santos is literally the perfect example of that. Gui Santos was absolutely thriving when Jonathan Kuminga was injured, and the Warriors with Jimmy Butler were figuring out various lineups where it was working really well, with Gui Santos getting something like 15 to 25 minutes per game. And when Santos doesn't have to worry about, oh, am I gonna get yanked because I made this one mistake, which Steve Kerr obviously has a great tendency to do, well, that's going to strip away the confidence of Gui Santos, and we've seen some of that since the return of Kuminga. And given the fact that Gui Santos has been way more viable for this team from an all-around overall standpoint, in terms of fit next to Jimmy Butler, in terms of fit next to Steph Curry and everybody else on this team, it's very clear as day that the Warriors are going to have to give their minutes to Santos to play that forward combination, whether it's the small forward or whether it's the power forward. And in the closing lineup, let me get to this now. The best iteration of this season when it comes to the small ball lineup that the Warriors ultimately try to close that second quarter and the fourth quarter with is Gui Santos. So Jimmy Butler, Gui Santos, and Draymond Green combination have a net rating of 18. That roughly doubles the net rating of Moses Moody, Draymond, and Butler combination. So think about this. I just gave you all the names that they could use in terms of the small lineup, the combinations, in terms of who gets to play that small forward spot. We've seen GP2 numbers, we've seen Buddy Hield numbers, we've seen Moody numbers, and we've seen Jonathan Kuminga's numbers, and we've seen Gui Santos' numbers. Which one is the best? It's not even close. It's not even remotely close. The Warriors already figured this out while Kuminga was out of the equation and Gui Santos was getting closing opportunities. In case people forgot, the Pistons game, the Knicks game, all these games where they were trying Gui Santos in those small iterations, he by far was the most reliable in terms of being that third forward next to Draymond and Jimmy Butler, in terms of being able to help in the rebounding department, because those two guys need help in the rebounding department. Those two alone are not good enough to survive the final minutes of the game when they're trying to rebound everything and make sure that they clean up the glass so that they get defensive stops, which is what you ultimately need in order to go win games. Get stops, get your rebound, and then go attack. When they go to these smaller iterations, obviously from an idealistic standpoint, closing with Gui Santos isn't necessarily the greatest thing in the world. The guy came up from the G League and he's only 22 years old. He's also inexperienced, has never really played playoff minutes. Unfortunately, that's the situation and position that Joe Lacob and the front office put this team under due to the youth movement. Because of Jonathan Kuminga, Moses Moody, all these young guys, Pajemski, they just wanted to keep all the kids without bringing in better veterans that are capable of closing games in a really powerful way with enough size and all these things, with all the different skill sets that are conducive to helping Steph Curry win another title. Because veterans and guys who have been there and done that are the guys that you need in order to go and try to win a title with. That is just common sense. And this front office has completely and utterly failed Steph Curry for years now in that regard. So now the Warriors are stuck with having to work with whatever it is that they got, the best that they got. This is part of the reason why we wanted to get a look at Kevin Knox. This is why we wanted to get a look at Jackson Rowe. And this is why we wanted to get a look at Braxton Key, because those are forwards that are older, have been there, done that, are capable defensive players. They're veterans of sorts, and we needed to get a good look at them in the regular season. But we really didn't get those opportunities, and Steve Kerr never really experimented in that regard. And to be honest with you, out of all those names, the only one that might have had a shot to be potentially better than Gui Santos in some instances may have been Braxton Key. And again, if Steve Kerr understood these things, he would have experimented with Braxton Key more. But he didn't. And Gui Santos is the best that we got. And that's why, going into the playoffs, Steve's going to have to roll with his best guy at that forward spot if he wants to go smaller to close games. And that is Gui Santos and nobody else. Nobody else if you want to go smaller. Now, that shooting guard spot is very interchangeable. You can go with Pods depending on the situation. You can go with Moses Moody depending on the situation. And for smaller segments, you may even be able to go with Buddy Hield depending on whether he's making his shots or not. I highly doubt that he's going to be hitting shots in a bunch of closing minutes. So most likely it's going to end up being Pods or Moody, one of their starters. And because you must prioritize defense when you get into the playoffs, Moses Moody is clearly more capable from a defensive standpoint. Again, he has a 7'1" wingspan. Pods has like a 6'5" wingspan. And for all the charges that Pods is able to take, he often gets blown by some of the better competition, some of the better guards in the league. He's not able to stay in front of them. And that is most of the time not good enough to close. And as a matter of fact, it is Steph Curry, Moses Moody, Santos, Butler, and Draymond Green who have a net rating of 35. That closing unit has a net rating of 35. What are we even talking about? There is nothing to discuss here. The Warriors' best iteration in terms of a smaller lineup where it's like a lot of interchangeable players with enough size, just enough size, where they can hold up defensively so that they can be powerful on the offensive end. Remember, guys, it is useless to be powerful on offense if you cannot handle the basics. You can't rebound. You can't stop guys from penetrating and getting whatever they want. You have holes in your lineup. You have guys that are getting burned. You have guys that are getting tooled. And you have guys that can't rebound well enough against bigger competition. And when you have that, you're not really a playoff team. Now, I will say this, if the Warriors need a little more offense and they have a little bit of a lead, it's a different thing if the Warriors have like a 5-point lead in a game. In this case, you want to purely focus on the defensive ability of your closing lineup. But if they have more like a 10 to 12 point lead, then, and if Pods has it going in that particular game, then you may be able to close with them. Now we have a very small sample size. The Warriors have tried Pods with that closing lineup at the shooting guard spot over Moses Moody for a 5-minute segment, meaning it's Steph Curry, Pods, Santos, Butler, and Draymond, and that unit has a net rating of 25.5. Now, unfortunately, we haven't really seen the iteration where it's GP2 is at that shooting guard spot, meaning it's Steph Curry, GP2, Santos, Butler, and Draymond. We haven't seen that, but we have seen this iteration. It's Steph Curry, GP2, Moody, Draymond, and Butler. And that lineup has shown to be not good enough, not big enough. Even though it has 2 POA guys, there's not enough help in the front court in terms of its rebounding ability. Getting stops in the paint and being able to rebound thereafter, that is a vital part of your closing lineup and the ability of your closing lineup. That is the most important thing. When you're talking about a closing lineup of Steph Curry and a bunch of defenders, all of those things have to be in place. And again, essentially that three-guard combo of Steph Curry, GP2, and Moody, they have a net rating of 4.8. 4.8. The Warriors should not ever be closing with a lineup that small because it wasn't viable in the regular season, and it sure as hell is not going to be viable in the playoffs. So I'm just giving you definitive evidence of what Steve Kerr needs to do in terms of his closing lineup with his small units, which is his favorite thing to do literally for all the title runs. Ever since Nick Uran suggested putting Iguodala into the starting lineup and the Warriors go with a small lineup in their first finals back in the 14-15 season. Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Andre Iguodala, Harrison Barnes, and Draymond. Remember that iteration? That was called the death lineup, and that's because they had enough size, enough defensive versatility, enough rebounding, enough switchability. I mean, think about it. Their shooting guard, Klay Thompson, is 6'7", 230 pounds. So just a lot of defensive versatility across the board. That is what made them so great. First and foremost, they could cover all the basics on the defensive end of the floor. Harrison Barnes can play power forward. Draymond can play center. Iguodala can play small forward. Iguodala and Harrison Barnes can interchange between small forward and power forward. And then offensively, they go and kill it. And in the second iteration, you had Kevin Durant in there instead of Harrison Barnes. That, needless to say, was also very powerful and got the job done. And then, for their fourth title, it was Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Andrew Wiggins, Otto Porter Jr., and Draymond Green. And then they blended in some things here and there where it may not be Klay Thompson, it may be GP2 at that shooting guard spot. But as long as the Warriors were closing with a combination of Andrew Wiggins, Otto Porter Jr., and Draymond Green, that was good enough to get it done in terms of going with smaller lineups, smaller units, and getting it done all the way to the finals. And nobody really thought much of Otto Porter Jr. when the Warriors initially picked him up for the vet minimum. And yet he was able to cover the prerequisites of the Warriors going to these smaller lineups and him being good enough to be in there to help the Warriors hold up defensively so that they can do what they do from an overall standpoint. And it's when they lost Otto Porter Jr., when these small lineups were completely and utterly failing the Warriors over the last 3 years. They tried to play Andrew Wiggins at the power forward spot in that role, and he couldn't do it because he's not good enough of a rebounder. He doesn't have the size to match up with the power forwards of the league and really help Draymond in that regard, and that was enough to basically destroy everything that they were trying to do, because if you can't close games with somebody who's actually viable to play the power forward spot, well then you're failing, and you're gonna lose these close games, and you're gonna end up in a bunch of clutch games instead of putting teams away because you're not good enough defensively. Yeah, Steve Kerr had the nerve to believe that any old guy who's 6'7" can just go in there and play power forward willy-nilly. Nope. Andrew Wiggins couldn't do it. Jonathan Kuminga couldn't do it. Moses Moody couldn't do it. GP2 couldn't do it. I mean, putting GP2 at the power forward spot. What an utter joke. And this is the problem that Steve Kerr has been having forever, up until they got Jimmy Butler, who can actually play power forward. So the power forward issue has finally been solved. Now, Steve has to figure out who fits the best at that small forward spot, and that is Gui Santos. And again, I would have preferred to have somebody who is way more experienced than a Gui Santos. Because let's not get it twisted. Gui Santos has his share of weaknesses for all the good things that he does. He's inconsistent from a shooting standpoint, from a creation standpoint, from a POA standpoint, from a one-on-one standpoint. Some of these weaknesses will hurt him. But because of his overall play and the fact that he can be really powerful from a rebounding standpoint. And there's a really old powerful saying, those who control the boards control the game. And because he has that factor, he's able to fit into what the Warriors want to do from a small lineup standpoint. And this is one of the most important ingredients of this season, because I promise you, Steve Kerr is going to go to it. And if he goes to anybody but Gui Santos, is not going to be good enough. The Warriors are done. They're going to lose to the Rockets if they do anything other than Gui Santos at that small forward power forward spot next to Butler and Draymond. So that's a huge key. To start the games, the Warriors need to go bigger. They're going to need to sit Potts or Moody as the playoffs continue and go forward and the Warriors face adversity because they're too small in all these things, because Steve is going to have to learn the lesson the hard way that these small lineups are not going to work in the playoffs. So at this point, the most experienced center on this team is Kevon Looney, and he's going to make them more viable from a defensive standpoint to start games, which is why he needs to replace one of Potts or Moody, and the Warriors will become bigger, more viable from a defensive standpoint. They don't have to help nearly as much as they have been doing with these smaller iterations. They need help every single possession down because nobody is good enough to consistently hold their own against their own man most of the time. And a defense that helps is really great and important, but when it's a defense that has to help pretty much every single time down, that is a vulnerable defense. That is a defense that is not good enough, especially to close a game. You have to have enough one-on-one ability. You have to have switchability, and you have to have guys that can be trusted from a defensive standpoint, from a fundamental standpoint, from a box out standpoint, from a rotational standpoint, and most importantly, from a rebounding standpoint. You can't hope to play real basketball and winning basketball when you're failing at the most basic fundamentals of the game of basketball. It's plain and simple. And this is why I am going to prioritize the importance of Trayce Jackson-Davis, because sometimes he defensively is better than Kevon Looney. So when you're talking about the order of importance from a defensive standpoint, it's Looney, Trayce Jackson-Davis, and then Quinton Post. But of course, Steve has been prioritizing his shooters and offense before his defense, which is why he prioritizes Buddy Hield over Gui Santos, which is complete and utter nonsense. So the order of importance from a defensive standpoint. So if I had to give you 9 names that need to be in rotation in the playoffs long term, it is Steph Curry, Moody, Butler, Draymond, Loon. That's your first 5. And then off your bench, you have Santos, Trayce, Potts, and let's say Post. And then the next 2 guys that are going to be getting spot minutes at best for this team would be Jonathan Kuminga and Buddy Hield. And if you saw that Lakers-Timberwolves game, you saw a glimpse of how important defense is. The Lakers are prioritizing their best offensive players. They need to ideally bench Austin Reeves so that they can replace him with a powerful defender, because you're going to have to run your offense through LeBron James and Luka. They have enough defensive issues there as it is. You can't have another guy in there who's like a neutral on defense and expect to do anything in the playoffs. See, these fundamentals when it comes to defense and defense leaning when you get to the playoffs is true for all teams. If you're allowing the other team to get what they want because you have a bunch of starters that are not good enough defensively, you're not a real team, you're not going to be a real team, and you're not going to make real noise until you make proper changes that prioritizes your defense over your offense. And I promise you, if Steve Kerr is able to organize his rotations where he leans and favors defense over his offensive players like Buddy Hield and Post, and again, I like Post. I think Post should be getting spot minutes, and I think he plays really well next to Jimmy Butler as that shooter that Jimmy Butler finds when he's creating the offense. And they need to see if they can create some opportunities there in spot minutes for Post. And if they're able to, great. If they're not able to find Post for any 3-point shots because the defense is prepared for him, then there's little use for Post in terms of defensive viability for him to help the Warriors in terms of disallowing the other team from getting whatever it is that they want once they get into the paint area. The guy that's going to help the Warriors enhance their defense is Trayce Jackson-Davis, not Quinton Post. Will Steve Kerr be able to figure this out? I have no idea. He hasn't been able to figure it out all season long, so I'm not holding my breath. But my official prediction is that if Steve Kerr can maximize his defensive rotations that include his best defenders before his best offensive players, because guess what? Offensively, you have 2 guys that are basically an entire system by themselves. Jimmy Butler, you have a Jimmy Butler-centric lineup. You call it a Jimmy Butler-centric lineup for a reason, because he can create offense for everybody else that he's playing next to all by himself. Same thing with Steph Curry. He can create an offense all by himself, whether it's creating for others, whether it's creating for himself. You got 2 guys that can create offense for everybody. And you're more worried about, oh, Let's make the offense more powerful while we sacrifice on defense. That is unserious. So it's the playoffs. Lean into Steph Curry, lean into Jimmy Butler, and lean into whoever else has it going that night. But otherwise, protect them and surround them with a bunch of powerful defensive lineups. Steph Curry and defense. Jimmy Butler and defense. Steph Curry, Jimmy Butler, Draymond, and defense. Turning the Warriors into a grit and grind team and relying on the superpowers of Steph Curry and Jimmy Butler. That is what's going to help the Warriors go all the way to the finals and give them a shot to contend for a title and win their 5th championship this season. If Steve Kerr does anything but that and think that that's going to get them anywhere, we're going to find out. That's my prediction. Lean defense and rely on Steph Curry and Jimmy Butler, go all the way to the finals. Lean offense, play a bunch of healed, play a bunch of post, and ignore the defense, play a bunch of small lineups and a bunch of 3-guard lineups. You do a bunch of this stuff, they are not getting out of the Western Conference. We'll see what happens. The Warriors are going to be playing their first game against the Rockets on Sunday night. And something tells me that Steve Kerr, unless he changes up in that first game, if he goes with the same fundamentals of the regular season, a small starting lineup, a small closing lineup, and lineups that don't make sense enough, he's going to end up learning some harsh lessons. And then he's going to have to correct those errors to really be able to get out of the first round and do anything. We'll see what happens. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time.